I didn't even have time to kick the dust off my boots or grab a cold beer before I realized someone had tried to carve a piece out of my soul while I wasn't into oppos. Looking. My name's Wyatt Sterling, and about 6 months ago, I inherited my great-uncle Silas's ranch out in Blackwood Valley, a place that smells like dry pine and old memories, sitting way out where the cell service dies and the stars actually look like something. Silas was a hard man, a bachelor who lived for that land. And when he passed, he left me every acre of the 400 we call Sterling Rise, or at least, that's what the deed said. I've been working a high-stress corporate gig in Chicago, drowning in spreadsheets and gray walls, so the idea of retreating to the middle of nowhere felt like a godsend, a chance to breathe, you know? But the moment I cleared the final ridge on that long, winding gravel driveway in my beat-up F-150, my heart didn't oppose. Just sink. It stopped. There, nestled right in the golden grass basin of the South Pasture, were 4 pristine, modern farmhouse-style cottages with wraparound porches and those trendy black window frames that look like they belong in a magazine, not on a working ranch. I sat there with the engine idling, the vibration of the truck humming through my bones, just staring at these intruders sitting on my dirt like they'd grown there overnight. There were little manicured gravel paths, flickering solar lanterns, and a big timber archway at the entrance that read in quote, "The Sanctuary of Blackwood, a premier HOA retreat," end quote. Now, you have to understand, the nearest neighbor to the Rise is 3 miles away, and the idea of an HOA, a homeowners association, existing out here was about as likely as a blizzard in the Sahara. I hopped out, my boots crunching on the ground, and walked down to the nearest unit, which had a little wooden sign hanging by the door that said the Willow Suite. I peered through the window and saw high-end linens, a bottle of local wine on the counter, and a laminated in quote, "Welcome guest" in quote, binder with a Wi-Fi password. I felt this heat, this slow-burning, prickly kind of rage starting at the base of my neck because this wasn't an oppos. Just a mistake. This was an invasion. I marched up to the main ranch house, my mind racing through every legal document I'd signed after the funeral. I dug through Silas's old heavy oak desk until I found the original surveys. Every map, every historical plat, and every tax record confirmed that South Pasture was the heart of the Sterling property, a spot Silas used to call the cradle end quote, because of how the hills shielded it from the wind. As I was sitting there, gripped by a cold realization that someone was making a fortune off my inheritance, I heard the crunch of tires outside. Expensive, heavy tires. I walked onto the porch just as a woman in a cream-colored pantsuit stepped out of a Cadillac Escalade that looked like it had never seen a speck of mud in its life. She had hair so blonde and stiff it looked like fiberglass, and she was carrying a leather-bound clipboard like a shield. End quote. "You must be the nephew," end quote, she said, her voice like fine grit sandpaper disguised by a fake, honey-sweet smile that didn't end oppos. Reach her eyes. End quote. "I'm Margaret Vance, president of the Blackwood Heights HOA, and I'm going to need you to move that truck of yours. It's blocking the view for our 4 p.m. check-in, and frankly, you're looking a bit disheveled for the aesthetic we maintain here." End quote. I just stood there for a second, blinking, wondering if I'd stepped into an alternate dimension where common sense went to die. I told her as calmly as I could that she was standing on private property, that there was no HOA within 20 miles of this valley, and that those cottages were currently an illegal encroachment on my land. Margaret didn't oppose, even flinch. She just let out this little, condescending titter like I was a toddler explaining how the moon works. End quote. "Oh, honey," end quote, she said, tapping her clipboard, end quote. "Your uncle Silas signed the easement agreement 4 years ago when we expanded the Heights development. This basin was designated as an oppos, community amenity space and oppos, in exchange for a lifetime maintenance waiver, and it's all been filed, stamped, and settled with the county zoning board," end quote. I felt a chill go through me then, because Silas didn't end oppos. He just loved that land. He worshipped it, and there wasn't an oppos. A snowball and oppos. As chance in hell he would have traded his end quote, cradle end quote, for a maintenance waiver on a house he took care of with his own 2 hands. I told her Silas had been battling severe dementia for the last 5 years of his life, that he hadn't end oppos. Known his own name half the time, let alone how to negotiate a land easement. Margaret's smile sharpened into something predatory, something cold, and she told me that if I wanted to, make a scene, I could talk to their legal team, but until then, I was technically a guest on HOA-managed grounds and should act accordingly. She drove off, leaving me standing in the dust, and that was the moment the Chicago Wyatt, the guy who spent 10 years negotiating hostile takeovers and spotting fine print traps, woke up and decided to go to war. I didn't end Oppos. T sleep that night. I spent it scanning every scrap of paper Silas left behind, and that's when I found it. A single, crumpled letter from the Blackwood Heights HOA dated 3 years ago, threatening a lien on the property for, unpaid common area dues, Silas had scrawled, thieves, across the front in a shaky, trembling hand, and it broke my heart to realize he'd spent his final years being bullied by a woman in a pantsuit while he was losing his mind. The next morning, I was at the county clerk's office before the lights were even on. I met a guy named Dale, a man who looked like he'd been born behind a desk and had seen every dirty trick in the book. When I showed him my deed and asked to see the easement Margaret mentioned, he went into the back and stayed there for nearly an hour. When he came back, his face was pale, and he slid a document across the counter that made my blood run cold. It was an annexation and boundary adjustment, form, signed 3 years ago, supposedly by Silas Sterling. But even a blind man could see the signature was a fraud. It was a smooth, flowing script, not the jagged, painful scrawl I'd seen on Silas's letters. Even worse, the document had been notarized by a woman named Sarah Vance, Margaret's own daughter, and approved by a zoning officer named Miller who, according to Dale, had taken an, early retirement, in the Caribbean about 6 months back. It was a classic, land grab, play. They'd waited until Silas was too confused to fight back, forge his name to redraw the map, and then build a luxury, glamping, business under the guise of an HOA to funnel the profits. Dale whispered to me, almost like he was afraid of the walls listening, that Margaret Vance basically ran this county, and if I wanted to fight her, I'd better have a bigger gun than a forged signature. I didn't end Oppos. T called the police yet. I knew Margaret had them in her pocket. Instead, I called an old friend from the city, a shark of a real estate attorney named Leo, who lived for the kind of cases that ended with someone in handcuffs. Leo spent 48 hours digging through the digital footprints of, the sanctuary, and found that the rental income wasn't in Oppos. T going to the HOA and Oppos. Reserve fund at all. It was being routed through a series of shell companies that eventually landed in a private offshore account held by Margaret and her daughter. They weren't in Oppos. T just stealing my land. They were embezzling from their own HOA members to fund their luxury lifestyle. But I needed a, smoking gun, something that would make it impossible for the local cronies to look the other way. And that's when I decided to play a little game of my own. I went down to the cottages that afternoon with a set of heavy-duty padlocks and a chainsaw. I didn't in Oppos. T touched the buildings. That's a legal gray area, but I did cut down that, sanctuary, archway and dragged it right across the access road. When the, property manager, a meathead named Rick who looked like he'd been hired for his biceps rather than his brains, came running out screaming about, interference with business operations, I just leaned against my truck and smiled. I told him that since the easement was under, legal review, I was exercising my right as the primary deed holder to secure the perimeter against, unauthorized trespassers, which included him. He called Margaret, and 10 minutes later, she was back, screaming so loud the birds left the trees. She threatened me with every lawsuit under the sun, calling me a, bitter, ungrateful interloper, who was ruining a prestigious community. I waited until she ran out of breath. Then I pulled out my phone and played a recording of my conversation with Dale at the clerk's office, specifically the part where we discussed the forged signature and her daughter's expired notary stamp. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint, but she was a snake, and snakes always have one more bite. She told me it didn't in Oppos. T matter what I thought I knew because she had, friends, who would make sure any investigation died on the vine, And if I didn't in Oppos, T clear the road, I'd be spending the night in a cell. That's when Leo pulled up in a black sedan, looking like the harbinger of doom. He stepped out, handed Margaret a federal subpoena, and calmly explained that we hadn't in Oppos. T gone to the local sheriff. We'd gone to the state attorney general's office and the IRS. See, when you start routing rental income through shell companies and claiming property tax exemptions on land you don in Oppos, T legally own, the alphabet boys tend to get very interested very quickly. Margaret's friends at the county level Kuden and Oppos. T protect her from a federal tax evasion and wire fraud investigation. The next week was a blur of flashing lights and boxes of documents being hauled out of the Blackwood Heights office. It turns out Margaret had been doing this for years, finding elderly landowners with no heirs, annexing their land through forged easements and building these little rental empires. She'd stolen millions from the valley, but my uncle Silas was the one she'd gotten greedy with, the one who had an heir who knew how to fight back. The HOA members, the actual residents of the Heights, were horrified to find out their dues had been used to build Margaret's private sanctuary on stolen ground. They didn't in Oppos. T just support me. They formed a mob at the courthouse, demanding Margaret's head on a platter. The final blow came when the retired zoning officer, Miller, got cold feet in the Caribbean and flipped on Margaret in exchange for immunity. He admitted to taking a $50,000 bribe to look the other way while the maps were redrawn. Margaret and Sarah were arrested in front of the whole town, handcuffed and led away while the local news cameras caught every humiliating second. I watched from the porch of Silas's house, feeling a weight lift off that valley that had been there for way too long. But the story didn't end Oppos. T end with a neat little bow and happily ever after, Once the dust settled, the court ruled that the cottages were permanent fixtures built with illegally obtained funds on my land. Technically, I own them now. The HOA members, who were now self-governing and trying to fix the mess Margaret left, begged me to keep them and run them as a legitimate business to help bring tourism to the valley. They even offered to manage them for a percentage. But I looked at those modern, black-framed farmhouses sitting in Silas's cradle, and all I could see was the greed, the forgery, and the way they tried to erase a man who couldn't and Oppos to defend himself. I hired a demolition crew. People call me crazy. They said I was tearing down $500,000 in passive income. My own lawyer, Leo, told me I should at least think about the tax benefits of keeping them. But some things are worth more than a bottom line. I watched the excavators tear into those designer walls, watched the sanctuary turn to a pile of splintered wood and broken glass. And when the last truck hauled away the debris, I spent the afternoon seeding that basin back with native grass. It's been a few months now, and the cradle is starting to look like itself again. The deer are coming back. The wind whistles through the hills without hitting a luxury porch, and the silence is finally honest. I'm staying here, running the rise the way Silas did, but I'll tell you this. I keep a shotgun by the door and a copy of my deed in a fireproof safe, because people like Margaret Vanston and Oppos, go away, they just change their tactics. Now, I want to hear from you guys. Was I the jerk for tearing down perfectly good houses that could have helped the local economy, or would you have done the same thing to protect your family in Oppos? As legacy? Is there such a thing as clean money when it's built on a foundation of lies? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because out here in the valley, your word is supposed to be your bond, but it seems like nowadays people are more interested in what they can steal than what they can build. Don and Oppos, forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories from the Rise, where we Don and Oppos. Just grow cattle. We grow a backbone. Take care of yourselves and keep an eye on your property lines.